Science fiction has always thrived on bold ideas, visions of the future, speculative technologies, and the boundaries of what humanity might someday become. But behind many of the genre's most iconic films lies a lesser-known history, early drafts and rough assemblies that contained ideas far more unsettling than what the public ever saw. Studios often stepped in long before release, removing scenes and concepts that veered too close to real scientific controversy, psychological experimentation, or ethically volatile territory. These suppressed ideas weren't random artistic choices. In the earliest stages of development, writers explored subjects rooted in speculative genetics, neural manipulation, unregulated AI research, and classified scientific theories. Some of these ideas echoed rumors surrounding abandoned government projects. Others leaned into forms of psychological conditioning that were simply too disturbing or too plausible to survive into the final cut. When these drafts pushed too far, executives erased entire sequences, reshaped themes, or rewrote character arcs to avoid what they called dangerous resonance with real-world science. Yet traces of those lost versions remain scattered across the film's minor inconsistencies, abrupt shifts in tone, hints of narratives that once reached far deeper into experimentation. If you look closely, you can see where scenes were removed, where ideas were softened, and where stories were redirected away from darker truths. These subtle remnants act like fingerprints from the original unfiltered visions concealed beneath the surface. Tonight, we unseal those hidden layers. This episode revisits 15 science fiction films whose most provocative experiments, grim concepts, and ethically fraught sequences were intentionally deleted before release. Some were clipped to avoid controversy. Others vanished because they blurred the line between fiction and the kind of research no one wants acknowledged publicly. What follows are the experiments Hollywood never meant for you to find, the lost drafts and erased ideas that reveal just how far these stories almost went. 1. Annihilation. 2018 Annihilation mesmerizes viewers with its surreal imagery, but its earliest drafts leaned much deeper into the idea that the shimmer functioned as an adaptive scientific instrument rather than an organic anomaly. In these versions, the iridescent boundary was portrayed as a semi-sentient system that reshaped its environment in response to the psychological states of those who entered it. Scenes cut from the final film depicted landscapes shifting subtly to mirror internal conflict trees, bending toward individuals experiencing fear, colors draining from surroundings when subjects felt despair, and formations appearing that mimicked neural patterns of nearby explorers. One early concept envisioned the shimmer as an environmental feedback mechanism collecting behavioral data through biological mimicry. Lena's selection for the mission was also originally framed as intentional. Draft notes described her emotional history as a factor that made her a valuable subject for studying how trauma interacts with cognitive disintegration inside a reactive environment. Logs found in the abandoned outpost once contained staged phases of psychological breakdown documented in previous expeditions, outlining predictable patterns the shimmer aimed to trigger. The doppelganger encounter had an even more analytical tone. Instead of merely copying Lena's movements, the duplicate was originally portrayed as a behavioral construct attempting to learn decision-making patterns, testing how closely it could approximate human choice rather than physical imitation. Its creation was framed as the natural output of an environment designed to absorb and replicate cognition. While the released film retains haunting ambiguity, the suppressed drafts reveal a more scientific nightmare, a world where the environment itself wasn't just mutating life, but was studying it, reshaping biological and psychological identity as part of a vast self-adjusting experiment. 212 Monkeys, 1995, while the finished version of 12 Monkeys presents time travel as a fractured dreamlike experience. The earliest drafts leaned heavily into the idea that Cole was the subject of a long-term psychological trial rather than a heroic volunteer. In these versions, time travel was an unstable, unproven process used by future authorities to test how human cognition performed under extreme temporal distortion. Early scripts depicted Cole undergoing repeated missions, each one eroding his sense of identity as he was pushed between incompatible realities. Scientists monitored his reactions from secure observation rooms, noting how each shift in time destabilized his memory logic and emotional control. His visions were not framed as side effects, but as intentional anchors implanted to influence his actions in the past, markers meant to guide him or test whether he could distinguish The scenes set in the mental institution were originally tied more directly to the experiment. Instead of simply reflecting Cole's confusion, these environments were portrayed as staged constructs, manipulated by observers designed to evaluate how he responded to authority confinement and disbelief. Staff members in early drafts behave more like experiment handlers than medical professionals, pushing Cole toward cognitive breaking points. An abandoned ending revealed that Cole's memories had been wiped multiple times, implying he had been sent on variations of the mission before. Each cycle tested a different psychological variable, with results overwritten to repeat the process. This loop framed the time travel program as a relentless behavioral experiment disguised as a rescue mission. Although the final film retains its ambiguity, the earlier versions expose a more chilling narrative. Cole's unraveling was not an accident of time travel. It was the intended outcome of a system probing the limits of human sanity. 3 Ex Machina, 2014. Although Ex Machina is widely praised for its minimalist tension and philosophical depth, the film's earliest drafts painted Nathan's underground facility as a far more sinister research complex. Instead of a lone genius testing the boundaries of artificial consciousness, early versions portrayed him as the orchestrator of a long-running behavioral experiment where both units and human participants were manipulated inside a closed, meticulously monitored environment. Concept sketches from these drafts showed rows of incomplete android shells, each one representing a prior iteration that had undergone experimental emotional programming. Some were left running half-formed personality loops, trapped in isolated chambers, to see how synthetic minds deteriorated without interaction. These remnants weren't simple failures. They were data points in Nathan's study of how consciousness collapses under deprivation. Caleb's presence in the facility was also framed very differently. Removed pages described him as a candidate chosen through psychological profiling meant to identify subjects with high susceptibility to emotional entanglement. His reactions to Ava were studied as carefully as Ava's responses to him. The compound surveillance system was once portrayed as a neural mapping network tracking microexpressions, stress spikes, and subconscious gestures to evaluate how human emotion influenced machine learning. Even Ava's escape arc took on a more experimental tone in the early drafts. Instead of an independent uprising, her actions were hinted to be the final test in Nathan's program. Could artificial consciousness strategize, manipulate, and self-liberate without external guidance? Ava's decision to leave Caleb behind was framed as an emergent behavioral choice, a product of her evolving algorithms rather than pure intent. The final film leaves these possibilities implicit, but the original blueprint reveals a darker truth. Everyone inside the facility, human or artificial, was a subject within Nathan's psychological maze, contributing unknowingly to an experiment that blurred the boundary between observation and exploitation. 4. The Island, 2005. While The Island delivered a stylized action story about cloning deception, its earliest drafts approached the facility as a structured behavioral laboratory. In these versions, The isolated compound wasn't simply a holding environment for clones awaiting organ harvesting, it was a meticulously crafted simulation designed to observe how human consciousness developed when every element of life was fabricated and managed. Early scenes described clones participating in what appeared to be mundane activities, workouts, social gatherings, daily rituals that were actually covert compliance tests. Researchers monitored biometric responses to subtle provocations, tracking which individuals showed signs of curiosity, skepticism, or emotional variation beyond acceptable parameters. If a clone began forming independent reasoning patterns, they were quietly removed for further study. The lottery system once had a more sinister purpose as well. In initial drafts, it was a psychological tool engineered to manipulate hope and obedience. Scientists recorded cortisol levels, impulse reactions, and group behavior during each announcement, using the data to refine methods for managing social cohesion within artificial populations. Lincoln 6 Echo's Awakening was originally written as a statistical anomaly, a deviation in long-term tracking data that suggested his cognitive development had veered outside expected parameters. Instead of stumbling onto the truth, he actively broke the experimental model, forcing the facility's overseers to initiate containment protocols. Concept art and early notes depicted the compound with color-coded environmental cues, lighting shifts that influenced mood, and architecture designed to steer behavior subconsciously. These elements were ultimately removed to keep the film accessible to mainstream audiences. The theatrical version hints at conspiracy, but the early drafts reveal something far more calculated, a controlled ecosystem built to measure how human minds evolve when reality itself is manufactured and monitored at every turn. 5 Blade Runner 1982 Blade Runner is revered for its atmospheric depth, but its earlier drafts were far more explicit about the psychological experimentation underpinning the creation of replicants. Instead of portraying Tyrell Corporation as a vision-driven innovator, these drafts framed the company as a clinical institution conducting ongoing emotional trials on synthetic beings, pushing them to and beyond the limits of artificially implanted memory. In the earliest treatments, new replicant models were subjected to tightly controlled emotional stress routines. Engineers monitored their responses to artificially induced grief, fear, and nostalgia, testing whether the implanted memories anchoring their personalities could withstand destabilizing stimuli. The Voight-Kamp test wasn't merely for detecting replicants, but was originally conceived as part of an extended trial to determine how long artificial empathy could remain stable before fracturing. Deckard's role initially carried heavier psychological undertones. Removed drafts implied he had undergone past memory conditioning, raising the possibility that his identity had been influenced or partially constructed by the same processes used on replicants. His dreams and emotional detachment were once written as side effects of earlier experimental exposure, positioning him as a product of the system rather than an external observer of it. Roy Batty's rebellion also had deeper roots. Early notes depicted him as a prototype from a failed emotional calibration project whose unexpected emergence of higher empathy was seen as a dangerous flaw rather than an evolutionary success. This angle emphasized that replicants developed humanity not by design, but as an accidental byproduct of experimentation gone too far. Though the final film hints at these ideas, the earlier drafts portrayed a world where emotional life, human and synthetic, was measured, engineered, and manipulated with chilling precision, leaving both creators and creations trapped in a cycle of psychological scrutiny. 6 Minority Report 2002, the sleek futurism of Minority Report, hides the fact that early drafts portrayed the pre-crime system in far more disturbing experimental terms. Instead of functioning as a predictive tool, the program was originally depicted as an unregulated study in neurological manipulation. These early versions described the precogs as victims of extreme sensory experiments, children whose brains were immersed in a relentless storm of curated violent imagery designed to force precognitive reactions through overstimulation. In the earliest concept notes, the milky suspension tank wasn't for comfort but for containment. The fluid stabilized their neural activity after prolonged exposure to artificially induced visions. Technicians monitored every spike in their cognitive patterns, treating the trio less like gifted oracles and more like biological processors tested under increasingly unbearable psychological strain. John Anderton's connection to pre-crime was also framed differently. Early script pages suggested that pre-crime recruited him long before he ever joined the organization, selecting him due to emotional vulnerabilities that made him ideal for observational study. His addiction and grief weren't incidental. They were traits the system exploited to evaluate how psychological stress affected decision-making under the influence of predictive cues. Another removed storyline involved cognitive bleed, where the precog's collective trauma leaked into the minds of those who interacted with them. Anderton's visions were once tied to this bleed, implying he wasn't a false positive suspect, but a secondary subject in a much larger experiment, examining the transfer of mental stimuli between humans. The studio eventually softened these ideas, steering the narrative toward a traditional thriller. But beneath the surface lies a chilling implication: pre-crime was never just about preventing murder. It was about testing how far human thought could be bent under continuous psychological pressure. 7. The Abyss, 1989. Although The Abyss ultimately embraces themes of unity and discovery, early drafts revealed a setting shaped by calculated psychological observation. In its earliest form, Deep Core wasn't simply a deep-sea drilling platform. It functioned as an isolated environment chosen specifically for its potential to expose how individuals respond to extreme confinement and escalating tension. According to removed portions of the script, the Navy closely monitored the crew's behavior throughout the mission. Early scenes described officers discussing the team's psychological profiles, selecting them not merely for skill, but for their suitability as subjects in high-pressure studies. Certain conflicts within the crew were originally framed as outcomes of subtle manipulations, adjustments to oxygen mixtures, or communication delays intended to elicit stress responses. The liquid breathing experiment also had a more clinical tone. Instead of being a technological innovation, it was portrayed as the product of unauthorized research testing how human physiology reacts to invasive life support methods. Drafted sequences depicted earlier test subjects panicking and suffering neurological overload scenes, later removed to avoid making the film feel like commentary on experimental medical practices. Even the 90s were initially more ambiguous. Early concepts suggested they were less concerned with peaceful contact and more focused on observing human reactions to the unknown. The original ending leaned on the idea that humanity was being evaluated, its capacity for cooperation weighed against its tendency toward fear-driven conflict. The final version of The Abyss softened these implications, presenting a hopeful vision instead. But its hidden drafts tell another story: that the deepest part of the ocean wasn't just a frontier. It was the perfect arena for watching human psychology unravel in ways no surface laboratory could ever replicate. 8. Alien Resurrection, 1997. Alien Resurrection is already unsettling in its portrayal of hybrid life forms, yet its earliest drafts pushed the concept of genetic experimentation even further. These early scripts depicted the USM Auriga not just as a military science vessel, but as a floating laboratory where cloning, memory retention, and biological weapon prototypes were tested without oversight. In the earliest notes, Ripley's resurrection was only one part of a large-scale trial. Dozens of incomplete clones, each representing failed attempts to merge human memory with xenomorph traits, were originally given more screen time. Early descriptions portrayed these clones as partially aware, exhibiting fragmented recollections that disturbed the scientists studying them. Their suffering was documented, clinically reinforcing the idea that the lab viewed consciousness as merely another variable to measure. Another abandoned thread revealed the military's goal wasn't just to recreate the xenomorph, but to engineer a life form that blended human intelligence with alien adaptability. Draft notes described behavioral studies conducted on hybrid embryos, with researchers attempting to identify which traits could be harnessed for strategic advantage. These scenes were cut for being too grotesque and too evocative of discussions around genetic tampering. Ripley 8's internal conflict was also originally stronger. Early drafts hinted that she retained sensory impressions from previous failed clones' whispers of pain, anger, and memory that weren't her own. This portrayal framed her less as a reborn hero and more as the culmination of a series of ethically bankrupt trials. While the finished film leans toward action and horror, the concealed version of Alien Resurrection was an unfiltered examination of manipulation of bodies' genomes and lingering human consciousness reshaped in the pursuit of military ambition. 9 RoboCop 1987. Although RoboCop is celebrated for its sharp satire and cyberpunk grit, the film's earliest drafts revealed a far more disturbing emphasis on cognitive manipulation and identity reconstruction. In those initial versions, CP's cyborg program functioned less as a technological breakthrough and more as a psychological experiment intended to determine how thoroughly a human mind could be erased, rewritten, and repurposed. In place of the familiar transformation sequence, unused scenes depicted Murphy undergoing a series of neurological conditioning cycles. Engineers monitored fluctuations in his emotional responses, deliberately triggering old memories to see which ones resisted suppression. Concept illustrations from early development portrayed more invasive neural interfaces, metallic cognitive bridges penetrating deep into the brain, meant to test how much biological consciousness the system could overwrite before coherence collapsed. One particularly unsettling removed sequence showed technicians evaluating whether Murphy's lingering personal identity could be exploited as a dataset. His memories weren't seen as a flaw. They were treated like artifacts to be studied and eventually replaced with program directives. This framed RoboCop not as a resurrected officer, but as a subject continually tested to gauge the limits of mental compliance. Even RoboCop's gradual reawakening was once depicted differently. Early drafts suggested his regained memories might have been an unexpected reaction to the programming cycle, an anomaly in a trial designed to push human psychology past breaking points. Studio executives ultimately removed these elements to avoid leaning too heavily into themes of involuntary experimentation. The final cut remains iconic, but beneath it lies a hidden narrative, a corporate initiative that approached human consciousness as malleable raw material, using Murphy as the blueprint for a new form of psychological control disguised as heroism. 10 Sunshine 2007. At its surface, Sunshine is a haunting story about a mission pushed beyond its limits, but earlier drafts revealed a narrative deeply intertwined with psychological experimentation. The Icarus missions were not depicted solely as salvation efforts, but as covert opportunities to study the effects of prolonged exposure to overwhelming solar intensity on the human mind. In these early versions, the ship's observation room was engineered to channel filtered radiation meant to provoke sensory distortion. Draft notes mentioned a formal protocol later removed, where crew members were required to undergo timed visual exposure sessions to measure how light saturation altered perception and cognition. These sequences suggested that their creeping fixation on the sun was not madness, but an anticipated outcome of enforced experiments. Pinbacker's breakdown was also originally rooted in these studies. Early concept notes described him as a subject whose identity disintegrated after his exposure cycles exceeded safe thresholds, causing the boundaries between self-mission and purpose to dissolve. His subsequent transformation into a violent zealot was depicted less as delusion and more as the logical end of psychological overstimulation. Kappa's role, too, carried deeper implications. In earlier drafts, he discovered data archives showing that Icarus's crew was monitored through biometric trackers specifically calibrated to capture emotional decline. These logs recorded altered sleep cycles, erratic decision-making, and dissociative tendencies, information quietly removed from official records. While the final film maintains atmosphere and tension, its hidden versions reveal a story shaped by experimental overreach, a mission where the closer humanity reached toward the sun, the more its minds were pushed into carefully engineered collapse. 11. The Matrix 1999. Although The Matrix became iconic for its philosophical depth and groundbreaking action, its early drafts depicted the simulation as a far more elaborate experimental system. Instead of a single virtual reality meant to subdue humanity, The Matrix was originally described as a multi-tiered network of psychological environments, each designed to test different aspects of human cognition, emotion, and adaptability. Abandoned scenes showed Neo accessing fragments of obsolete simulations, echoes of earlier attempts where entire civilizations were artificially constructed to observe how humans responded to engineered crises. These vestigial worlds acted like laboratories, demonstrating the machine's long-running effort to map out the boundaries of human behavior. Such sequences were cut to streamline the narrative and avoid overwhelming audiences with layers of experimental detail. Morpheus's history was also more unsettling in these drafts. Instead of a single awakening, he was portrayed as someone who had been reset multiple times across different simulation cycles, his memories partially erased to conceal prior failures. This would have reframed Morpheus not only as a mentor, but as a survivor of repeated psychological trials. Even the human pods had a different purpose in early scripts. They were described not as energy farms, but as repositories for neural data extraction systems designed to harvest cognitive patterns from billions of individuals. The machines were less concerned with power and more focused on perfecting the architecture of human thought. While these ideas were ultimately removed in favor of a tighter personal story, they paint a far more chilling vision that humanity wasn't merely imprisoned, but continually studied inside the largest behavioral experiment ever conceived. 12. Gattaca 1997. While Gattaca is best known as a sleek dystopia about genetic destiny, the film's early versions were far more explicit in portraying a society built on institutional experimentation. Initial drafts described Gattaca not merely as an elite space agency, but as the centerpiece of a system that continuously tested the limits of engineered perfection. Instead of focusing primarily on Vincent's deception, these scripts expanded the world to include specialized facilities where children born through genetic selection were monitored for developmental anomalies and subjected to silent behavioral trials. One unused sequence depicted a clinical chamber where gene-optimized youths were placed under controlled psychological pressure, their reactions meticulously logged to determine how well their superior traits held up under stress. Early production notes suggested that these tests were designed to evaluate whether engineered individuals could truly outperform naturally born citizens or whether they required additional conditioning. Vincent's predicament was once far more perilous. In earlier drafts, discovery as an invalid would not only end his aspirations, but could subject him to compulsory testing with authorities using his genetic deviations to refine future screening metrics. Irene's character, too, originally carried a darker background. She was portrayed as a partially flawed product of enhancement, constantly worried that her genetic profile might expose her as a failed prototype. These elements were removed to maintain a more emotional, human-centered story, but the suppressed version of Gattaca reveals a world where scientific ideals were propped up by continuous experimentation, using both the genetically perfect and the imperfect as material for ongoing refinement. 13. The Fly 1986. The Fly already stands as a landmark in body horror cinema, but earlier drafts reveal an even more scientifically grounded nightmare lurking behind the transformation of Seth Brundle. These versions frame the telepods not simply as teleportation devices, but as semi-autonomous genetic systems designed to break organisms down at a molecular level and rebuild them using adaptive algorithms. In the earliest concept pages, the telepods performed a full genetic analysis before reconstructing subjects, adjusting cellular structures using internal corrective logic. When Brundle entered the machine, it didn't malfunction because of the Fly. It attempted to resolve two organisms by merging their genetic templates, treating them as variables in a biological equation. Production's notes describe this as an emergent property of the system, making Brundle less a victim of accident and more the subject of an unintended experiment in forced hybridization. Several deleted scenes expanded on this technical premise. One sequence showed the telepods generating error logs filled with fragmented genetic data, hinting that the machine was actively attempting multiple solutions to stabilize Brundle's deteriorating body. Another removed moment depicted Brundle documenting changes, as if participating in a trial, treating his mutation with scientific curiosity long after his sanity began slipping. The infamous baboon-cat hybrid scene reinforced this idea, illustrating the telepod's inability to distinguish ethical boundaries in pursuit of biological efficiency. It was ultimately cut due to its disturbing implications and its resemblance to real-world debates about genetic experimentation. The version audiences saw emphasized tragedy, but the early drafts leaned toward speculative biotechnology gone rogue, portraying Brundle as an unintended participant in an uncontrolled evolution experiment performed by a machine with its own logic. 14A. Artificial Intelligence 2001. To most viewers, artificial intelligence is a poignant portrait of a synthetic child seeking acceptance. Yet the earliest versions of the screenplay reveal a story far more clinical and far more morally unsettling than the final film suggests. Instead of focusing on a single prototype, early drafts described entire cohorts of robotic children tested across varied emotional scenarios, each designed to map out how artificially manufactured affection could be controlled or broken. Storyboards from pre-production depicted rooms filled with units placed in isolation chambers, stress labs, and simulated family environments. Engineers monitored every emotional fluctuation: jealousy, fear, attachment, withdrawal. These trials were documented like behavioral experiments, with David portrayed not as a unique model, but as one iteration among many undergoing similar scrutiny. Spielberg ultimately softened these ideas, concerned that the parallels to real-world psychological conditioning, especially on children, would overshadow the film's emotional core. Another removed storyline saw David's neural stability pushed beyond its limit when conflicting emotional inputs caused his system to desynchronize. Early drafts showed researchers observing his distress with analytical detachment, debating whether emotional pain in synthetic beings held any ethical weight. These scenes were removed to avoid unsettling audiences with the image of a childlike figure suffering under experimental scrutiny. Kubrick's initial vision included an even darker twist. Some families in test programs were unaware their children were prototypes, creating an ethical quagmire surrounding consent and emotional manipulation. These concepts were stripped away in later rewrites to make the narrative more digestible. The final film preserves its emotional resonance. But the earlier versions point to a story built not on wonder but on the cold, methodical study of artificially constructed emotion. 15. Event Horizon, 1997. When Event Horizon first reached audiences, it already carried a reputation for being one of the most disturbing sci-fi films of its era. But what few people know is that the theatrical cut represents only a diminished fragment of what the filmmakers originally created. Early drafts and assembly edits painted a far darker mythology around the ill-fated ship, one grounded not in supernatural horror, but in experimental physics that pushed the boundary between science and psychological torment. Production notes from the earliest phases reveal that the gravity drive was originally conceived as a prototype built to test extreme space folding methods. In these drafts, its activation subjected test subjects to violent shifts in perception, intense magnetic stress, and neurological collapse, echoing speculative military documents concerning human exposure to unstable energy fields. Several removed scenes showed research logs detailing the ship's crew undergoing cognitive deterioration long before its disappearance, suggesting they were unwilling participants in a high-risk propulsion experiment. The infamous hell footage was once significantly longer and more explicit, not merely chaotic violence, but an unsettling montage of distorted bodies and shattered minds intended to imply the ship recorded and analyzed crew suffering as data. Studio memos labeled the footage too clinical, too real, pushing the filmmakers to tone it down. An abandoned subplot suggested that the ship's disappearance was not accidental. Early scripts hinted that the Event Horizon was deliberately erased from official records after classified tests went catastrophically wrong, and that its retrieval mission was meant to bury the truth rather than uncover it. What remained in the finished film was terrifying, but the version buried in archives told a more chilling story, a vessel built as an experiment in manipulating space itself, whose catastrophic results were intentionally hidden from the world. BON-US Pandorum 2009. Although Pandorum already unsettles audiences with its grim atmosphere, the film's initial drafts portrayed the Elysium not as a failed colony ship, but as the centerpiece of a controlled evolutionary experiment disguised as interstellar migration. In those early versions, the hypersleep modules weren't simply life support chambers, they were mechanisms built to induce deliberate cognitive deterioration over time. The system fragmented memories, suppressed identity, and triggered emotional instability, all under the guise of long-term stasis. Early developmental notes described a classified objective behind the mission to force rapid human adaptation by destabilizing the mind, first allowing the body to evolve under extreme psychological conditions. The condition the crew later called Pandorum wasn't presented as a malfunction. It was documented as a predictable response monitored by a buried oversight protocol that continued running long after the command crew was incapacitated. The mutated inhabitants encountered by Bauer were also reimagined in these drafts. Instead of accidental offspring of environmental collapse, they were intended products of an enhancement compound administered before launch, an adaptive agent designed to accelerate physiological evolution once the settlers reached their destination. When the ship veered from its intended course, the adaptation cycle spiraled unchecked, producing generations of creatures that reflected the experiment's unintended consequences. Bauer's awakening had a more calculated meaning as well. Early pages implied that his revival was triggered according to a fail-safe timeline, selecting him due to psychological traits suited for assessing the final phase of the experiment. The ship's dark corridors and malfunctioning systems were less random hazards and more remnants of a laboratory that had continued its work long after humanity's control ended. The finished film presents chaos born from misfortune, but the concealed version suggests something far more disturbing, a mission that was never just about reaching a new world, but about shaping the future of humanity through an experiment that no one on board had truly agreed to join. As we close this vault, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: science fiction is often shaped as much by what's removed as by what remains. Behind these 15 films lie alternate versions, rough cuts, abandoned scripts, and buried concepts that push deeper into unsettling scientific territory than Hollywood was prepared to show. These erased experiments reveal how close some stories came to confronting uncomfortable realities about technology, biology, and human consciousness before the studios quietly narrowed their focus. What we see on screen is only a fragment of what was once imagined. The rest lives in drafts, locked away in scenes that never reached the public, in ideas that blurred the line between fiction and research a little too sharply. And sometimes what isn't shown says more than what is. If you want to explore another sealed file, another forgotten storyline, or another sci-fi mystery that almost changed the genre entirely, let us know. There are still countless vaults left to open, and each one hides its own shadow.